I have the pleasure today to introduce Anton Jager, which is a lecturer at the University of Oxford. He holds a PhD in the history of political thought from Cambridge, and he has been quite a Stakhanovist in writing. So he has a lot of very interesting publications lately. So one with some sociologists at ULB was called Welfare for Markets, which is a history of universal basic income that came out 2 years ago. The book here, Hyperpolitics, is coming out next month, so you were one of the first to actually hear about this book. And he's also been writing on working on a manuscript from his PhD with Harvard University Press, if I'm right, on American populists in the 19th century. So I'm not going to say more things about Anton. I'm going to just let him start his presentation. So thanks again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me and see me? Yeah, see me, I hope so. Thank you so much for the introduction, Danielle, and thank you very much for the invitation. So, of course, I'll be speaking in English, but if anyone afterwards feels they really need to ask a question in French or in Dutch, that's absolutely allowed as well. And as you'll see, it is mainly about a book, but it also spans some other work that I've been doing across different fields. So this talk is about a book which, as Danielle said, will appear in English next month on the 18th of February. But that is actually a translation of a book that originally came out in late 2023, originally in German, here on the right. And it has a very complicated genesis history because it's mainly based off articles that were written in English that were then translated into German, then edited in a German version. And now the English version that's coming out next month is actually a reworked version of that German version based off the English originals that were originally put in. So it's a very multilingual and complex enterprise. But I do think that the English version, which will be out next month, is the most mature manuscript, or let's say the most mature version of the argument and the book. It also has a new preface because, of course, a lot has happened between 2023 and early 2026. Sadly, history moves very, very quickly in the 2020s, so any social scientific diagnosis has to keep up with the times. And luckily for me, but maybe unfortunately for the world, I do feel that even next month, the book is still relevant. So from a commercial point of view, that's very good. Maybe, let's say, from a political point of view, that's more ambiguous. So the book is called Hyperpolitics, as you can see. In German, it has a subtitle called Extreme Politicization Without Political Consequences, so Extreme Politisierung ohne politische Folgen. That subtitle doesn't appear on the actual cover title of the English one, but it does appear then in the book itself. It's a title which I feel slightly uneasy with now, or rather a subtitle, although I'm willing to defend a conditional version of it. But it, of course, is a book about a new concept, and it's a concept that's meant to make sense of a new political present as well. So to summarize what the book is about, it's about a mutation in political culture in the last 10 to 15 years. I'm mainly talking here about Western political culture. So that is, let's say, the United States and Europe, even though you can make some extrapolations towards the rest of the world. But I do have to admit that my empirical grasp of those cases is simply too limited to say anything with confidence about it. So in the book, it's mainly about what I call the political West or the OECD world. At the same time, it is inevitably also a global story, but that happens on a broader level of generality. So a mutation in political culture, particularly in the West, and the question, how might we conceptualize rather that change in political culture? Now, I want to start with an article that appeared, I think, about 2 years or a year and a half ago by one of the high priests of Anglo-Saxon liberalism, a columnist for the Financial Times called Janan Ganesh. I think he writes a weekly column for the FT. It's of variable quality. Sometimes it's very interesting. Sometimes it's, I think, deeply uninteresting. But this is a piece that appeared at the end, I think, of 2024. It's called The Rise of the Political Casual. And I think it gives a good indication of the kind of phenomenon that the book is trying to dissect. Of course, from a very specific elite perspective. So Ganesh is often part of a kind of Atlantic jet set very cozy with the London journalistic world and also with high finance. But the fact that even he is picking up on some of these signs should be an indication just how deep this transformation goes. And so the article is called The Rise of the Political Casual, and the subtitle is The Age of Apathy Made for Better Company and Less Dangerous Politics. So what is he actually talking about? I'm just going to go through the entire article here. It starts with a cocktail party somewhere in Scotland with some of Janan Ganesh's elite friends, and he describes a meeting with, I think, a woman who's also present at this party. So it's in Umbria, it's twilight, some summers ago, a social gathering in the hills. I'm easing into the evening when a British guest finds out what I do for work. And so he's a journalist. What do you think about Boris? So Boris Johnson in that case. She means, shall I tell you what I think about Boris? I perform my office, tossing out some thoughts about our then Prime Minister that she doesn't pretend to register. When it is her turn, I know what's coming. And she says, you know, behind the clown act, I reckon he's quite a shrewd operator. Then Janesh continues. This opinion, which was last interesting in 2001, is the political version of Arsenal wants to walk the ball into the goal. It is what you say when you care about the subject enough. So clearly he's very annoyed by the fact that someone at a cocktail party wants to talk about politics with him, where before politics seemed to be something he was exclusively interested in and was not a generally shared interest across society. And then he continues and says, in her defense, she's of the times. At the turn of the millennium, the golden age of apathy, of 60% voter turnout, casual political chat was rare because it was considered naff or in bad taste. It is now ambient or omnipresent. Whether events since Brexit, Donald Trump raised public engagement with politics or the higher engagement brought about by the events we'll come on to, either way, social life has changed so much for the worse that it is better to be vague about what I do for a living than risk embroilment in topical podcast-level jibber-jabber. So clearly the fact that he is a specialist in politics and, let's say, talks and writes about politics for a living, and that interest has now spread across society is proving quite irritating to him. And then he continues, there's a misconception that football fans aim to avoid people who have zero interest in the sport. No, the real drag is the casual, the office pest who wonders how your lot got on over the weekend. Not discussing something at all beats discussing it in half measures. Now imagine how much true that is of politics. 100 times across 2024, a near stranger will tell me that Trump is going to get back in. Given the closeness of US election, how is this worth saying? Now, I think that's a spectacular miscalculation, of course. Trump did get back in, but I think the general point he's trying to make there is very clear. If it were just boring, the rise of the political casual needn't trouble us, but there is evidence to suggest the stakes are much higher. And so it's not just a problem at his cocktail parties. Those who unbalanced Western politics over the past decades weren't just zealots. Your zealot being rare and so eerie as to spot it a mile off is containable. On the other hand, if millions of people go from serene indifference to politics to some commitment, that is another kind of test for civic order. So he's talking about a new form of political engagement or a new way of relating to politics that's very typical of the 2020s, which is not quite the same as zealotry or enormously high polarization, but a kind of ambient but very weak and not strongly institutionalized type of politicization. And then he makes some references to, of course, official party politics as well. So he says Jeremy Corbyn's movement, he's from the UK, wasn't one of seasoned cadres steeped in the key texts of the left, but of dabblers who thought him fresh and diverting. For a sense of how contingent the whole thing was, a discounted Labour membership fee was enough to prime the movement. And so he's talking about the fact that under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party was for a short period of time the largest party in Europe. And once Jeremy Corbyn was kicked out of the office of the leader, they immediately left the party as well. And then he continues, likewise, the feat of the Brexit campaign was to mobilize people that pollsters had considered outside of politics. Trump himself is a dilettante, not a lifelong politico. On a 10-point scale of political consciousness, we all know someone who went from 1 to 6 out of peak at the COVID-19 vaccines. And don't mistake a moderate degree of commitment for innocuous outcomes. Don't mistake apathy for being a bad citizen. Until a decade ago, I'd assumed that some civic engagement in a person was better than none. Multiplied across a nation, though, it means a higher aggregate volume of noise and expectation for a merely human political class. So he says, even I, who in the 2000s was hoping that people would be more invested in politics, deeply regret actually expecting that to happen. And the results have proven very ambiguous. And then he finishes very typically with a reference to political stand-up comedy. One American comedian here, so Jon Stewart has returned to host The Daily Show through no fault of his own. He's the father of the political casual. He said of the peculiar trend in which adults treat comedic programming, whether in pod or panel show form, as a kind of news. Politicized humor was so marginal in the 80s that it was alternative comedy. The case for all this output is that politics is so bizarre now as to be best handled by comedians. And then at the end, in the final paragraph, he says, Napoleon is meant to have said that to understand a man, consider what the world was like when he was 20. For me, that was 2002. Foreign affairs and terror aside, it might have been the most apolitical time in the West since the dawn of the universal franchise. I considered it normal and right. I was wrong on the first count. So here is someone who's obviously at a very specific level of society, but who's picking up a change in political culture, let's say in the last 10 to 15 years, that to him feels deeply disorientating for how he conceives of politics itself. Now, the question I want to ask in this presentation, and which the book also tries to answer, is there something to this intuition of Ganesh? Has there been an actual change in political culture? And more importantly, is there a way to make this anecdotal observation more objective and actually to quantify it? And then can we find some kind of concept that also historically contrasts that new political culture with previous political forms in the earlier 21st and also the 20th century. Now, if we look at some of the data, there is indeed a case for a very strong contrast compared to, let's say, 20 to 30 years ago. So here is just a list of statistics and graphs that indicate the decline or the age of apathy, which Ganesh documented in this article. For example, here is just some general data on declining turnout, mainly in Europe. From, let's say, the 1980s, or here from the 1950s and 2010s, you can very, very clearly see that, yes, there are fewer and fewer people that actually participate in elections. There is a crisis of electoral turnout. Anyone who was following debates in political science in the 2000s will know just how big a question this was about how do we get people to turn out and to vote again. Now, of course, if we measure political activity, that can't just be a question of formal electoral politics. You can also look at more informal street-level politics. And there also you can see that, for example, this is the case of the US, but there are similar graphs for Europe. There has been a marked decline in protest activity throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, certainly if you compare it to the high tide of the 1960s and 1970s. Now, of course, let's say the anti-globalization protests or the anti-Iraq war protests in the early 2000s mark an exception to this trend, but as a whole, you can see there is a secular decline. Now, this is the period, let's say, from the 1950s until the 2010s, which is a period of declining political activity. Ganesh's hypothesis is there's been a return of some political conscious engagement and activity since 2008, 2009. To him, it's an anecdotal observation. Is there anything quantitative, or can we measure this more objectively? And in fact, yes. So if you look at all the social scientific work on this question, both on a global but also on a more restricted Western scale, there's been a remarkable uptick, mainly in protest activity since 2008, 2009. So this is from The Economist in the late 2010s, where they measure protest activity both in Europe but also on a global scale, and they very strongly insist that there has been an increase in protest activity since 2008, 2009. So on that quantitative indicator, there has been an increase in political activity. There is a recent book by an American journalist called Vincent Bevins named If We Burn, the Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution that actually gathers also some of this data on it. And he reinforces this suspicion that we see in The Economist about rising protest activity. And he even calculates, although it's a contentious statistic, that the so-called decade of protests from, let's say, 2010 to 2022 or 2020 is probably the era in human history in which, both quantitatively and in terms of turnout, humans protested the most they ever did. So it's a record decade in terms of protest activity. So there again, Ganesh's suspicion that there has been an increase in political activity is borne out by most of the data. And you can see this also in the last year, so it's not just a question of 2010 to 2020, but also in the last 5 years in the 2020s, there is a remarkable uptick in protest activity, particularly also in the United States. And we can also see this on the level of electoral turnout. And this is where it gets really quite interesting. If we look, for example, at turnout for US presidential elections in the last 5 years, there are now record numbers of turnout. They're returning to levels that were last seen in 1904. So that's a 100-year high, and it's really something that can be registered once again to the 2010s. It's not just a question of presidential elections in the US. So as you can see on the right here, even for something like midterm elections that don't draw the same numbers, there is now the highest turnout for over 104 years. So there, the quantitative evidence for a renewed politicization or renewed investment and interest in politics seems to be very clear. Of course, these are American examples. America, I think, is a very spectacular case of the type of polarization and politicization we're talking about. But even if you look at some of the elections that usually inspire very low enthusiasm, namely European parliamentary elections, you can see they've reached a 20-year high in the last 5 to 6 years. And that means there's actually even a remarkable increase for some of these electoral turns that usually don't draw any voters at all. So yes, once again, Ganash's hypothesis can be borne out by some of this data. There has been a remarkable increase in political activity. Of course, this is a secular general trend. There are exceptions. There's no way to generalize across all these different cases, but structurally, you can clearly see this increase. Now, one tendency we've noticed, and which has been quite widespread, particularly in political commentary, is that this increase in political activity we've seen in the last 10 to 15 years, let's say since 2010, invites historical analogies. Right? There's a tendency to compare our current burst of politicization to, let's say, 20th century's episodes. And of course, the most widespread analogy that's often been made is with the 1930s and the 1940s. Because this is, once again, a kind of political model we have as to what an intensely polarized and politicized society looks like. And of course, there's another reason why this analogy is so attractive, because most of the increase in political activity, particularly in Europe and also in the US, has seemed to benefit forces on the far right of the political spectrum. And so the return of political activity seems to tendentially favor far-right forces, which once again invites comparisons with the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s as a previous era in which a very highly polarized and politicized society seemed to drift towards the far right. There are many examples of this historical parallel I could give here. There is, for example, a book on the question whether Trump in the US should be considered an instance of American fascism, which is treated in this book, Did It Happen Here?, which was edited by Daniel Steinmetz Jenkins. There are all kinds of talks about the question whether we're returning to the 1930s. And then here on the left, you can see a Flemish or Belgian example of this by Dirk Verhofstadt, who's written a so-called diary of the year 1933, where he sees an almost perfect parallel between the rise of far-right forces all across Europe and the ascent of Hitler in the early 1930s. Now, there are many reasons to be critical or rather skeptical of this analogy, or why it doesn't seem to be the case that we're actually returning to the 1930s. But the most important way to see the contrast is not just to look at, let's say, these indices of political activity or how politicized a society is, but a different kind of question: how institutionalized or how strongly organized is this type of political activity? And so if you go back to Aristotle with some basic political philosophy, the question is not just whether man is a political animal, but man is also a herd animal. There is a social side to this. And then the question doesn't just become how many people are protesting, how many people are participating in elections, how many people are engaging in political assassinations, but how many people are members of political parties, how many people are members of unions, how many are members of religious institutions, and how could you compare, let's say, these indices of political activity with the organizational indices of how strongly organized is this society. This is a very typical feature of that previous era of the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, is that it was an era of high politicization, a very strong polarization as well. But at the same time, that type of political engagement was also strongly institutionalized. It was very difficult to imagine political activity outside of organizations such as political parties or even paramilitary formations. That, I think, is the most important contrast with the political activity we're seeing in the last 10 to 15 years, is that it's actually gone hand in hand with a further decline in institutional membership. And here, of course, there's a massive social scientific literature, which we can talk about for hours, but I'm just going to give you a couple of indications. So as we're looking at an increase in political engagement and more people, let's say, expressing and communicating their political preferences, we're looking at the question of institutional membership or the organizational density of the society. And there, the kind of crisis that was first registered in the 80s and the 90s, much discussed in the 2000s, has only accelerated in the 2010s. And so this is just an indication of the voting tallies of traditional classical parties in Europe, particularly here in Belgium, in the last 10 to 15 years. This is already an indication of the trend I'm talking about, but here, that's the most spectacular example. We're looking at party membership in the UK from 1970 to 2016, and there you can very, very clearly see that massive slump in, or the crisis of party democracy, as it's called. What's truly striking here is that it's often a story that's told about the left, of how, let's say, the crisis of the 1980s and 1990s leads to decline and the weakening of left-wing parties, both in terms of turnout but also in terms of members. But here it's spectacularly a story of the right. Right? So in the 1960s, 1970s, the Conservative Party still had more members than the Labour Party had. In many ways, you could say that the Tories in the United Kingdom are actually the first mass party in Europe, before even the German SPD in the late 19th century. They had a massive civil society and a very large membership. And what we see is that since the 1980s and particularly the 1990s, there's been a really aggressive drop in their membership numbers. And as you have an increase in political activity, you can thus see that these institutional indicators continue to decline. So this is the British case. I'm just going to give you another couple of snapshots. This is American Union membership from the 1980s to the 2010s and 2020s. So despite some of the really enthusiastic reporting about an increase in American strike activity and the return of American unions, if you actually look at trade union density across the American economy, it's actually continued to decline even in the last 5 to 6 years. And then I will just give you one final snapshot quite close to home. This is, of course, the Belgian case. These are numbers that were gathered by Emilie Van Oort and Pascal de Witt, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years. There's now an updated version that's also circulating. Now, there again, you can see that there's a structural trend towards a decline of membership. What's particularly, I think, spectacular here is the fall of the PS in the last 5 to 6 years, where they've lost tens of thousands of members. There is maybe a question whether they were misreporting some of the members in some of these previous tallies. That certainly was the case for the Flemish liberals of the Open VLD, where they suddenly looked at their membership numbers and said, oh my God, half of these people have died, so we might need to scrap, let's say, half of our membership and also update our figures. Once again, the general story is very clear, a deep secular crisis for these membership organizations. And that, I think, is truly the reason why the analogy with the 1930s and 1940s is so difficult to make, because that was not the case at the time. Political activity and polarization was very high, but it was also very heavily institutionalized, where here we're looking at an increase in political activity together with a decline in institutional affiliation. Now, of course, there is already quite a large and very rich social scientific literature about this. The most famous example of this in the European case is probably the work of Peter Mayer. This famous book was published posthumously in 2014 called Ruling the Void. But once again, it's not an exclusively European story, because Mayer's central case studies are, let's say, party democracies all across Western Europe. But there's now also increasing literature, let's say, on the Republican Party in the US. So here on the left, you can see this book, Rogue Elephant, how Republicans went from the party of business to the party of chaos. And then more general work about American political parties by Daniel Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld called The Hollow Parties. But see the similarity here between Peter Mayer's title, so The Hollowing Out of Western Democracy, and then the American book on the right, namely The Hollow Parties, there's a very, very similar trend that can be detected both in the American and the European case, even with party systems that are so vastly different. And so it's very difficult to compare American parties to European parties. We're fully aware of this, but still at the same time, there's a similar institutional crisis that seems to have gripped them both. At the same time, one of the things that's very strange about reading that book by Peter Mayer from 2014 is a sense that he was describing an era of depoliticization and deinstitutionalization. So a decline in voter turnout, a decline in protest activity, together with a decline in institutional membership models. But what we see in the last 10 to 15 years is that part of his diagnosis no longer holds up, because there's now a record rise mainly in protest activity in all types of politicization. Not just on the right, but also on the left. So if we look, for example, at the Black Lives Matter protest of 2020 in the US, there are estimates that 25 million Americans participated in them. That's almost 1 out of 10. Of course, these numbers vary, but by any metric, that is probably the biggest protest movement ever in American history. You can see some of the numbers there on the bottom left for the No Kings protest that took part last year. On the top left, you can see the German anti-AfD or anti-far right protest, I think, of last year, which were mainly kicked off by the reveal, I think, of remigration plans by some of these far right parties that brought many Germans into the streets, clearly from the left. But then if you look at the bottom right, you're looking at the Unite the Kingdom march last summer in, of course, the United Kingdom, which, in contrast to previous far-right marches, almost brought a total of 150,000 protesters into the streets of London. So part of the Mayer story really does seem to hold still, namely the crisis of institutional membership continues. At the same time, there has been a remarkable increase in politicization and political activity without reinstitutionalization. And that is the basic hypothesis of the book, is to first describe this curious divergence, to say what is typical of political culture in the 2010s and the 2020s. Well, it's an instance of repoliticization without reinstitutionalization. And the term that it proposes to understand this is the so-called notion of hyperpolitics. Now, to put this very schematically, this is not at all, let's say, extremely mathematically careful, but if we put this intuitively and we put together some indices about, let's say, party membership, general density for civil society, and then different indicators for protest activity, electoral turnout, political assassinations. I want to point out, for example, that the last time there was an attack on an American president was, I think, in 1986, against Reagan. In the last presidential contest in the US, I think you had 2 attempts on Trump's life. That is in itself a record number, which I think is also just an indication of the degree of political involvement you can see around some of these contests in the US now. So if we take, let's say, the 1920s and the 1930s as the nominal peak of both politicization and institutionalization, to say that's when society was most politically engaged, but also very strongly institutionally organized, you can see what you can call an X-shaped development across the 20th and the 21st century. And it's particularly the last end of this graph that interests us, namely we see a K-shaped development in 2010s. A continued decline in membership organizations, a secular crisis of civil society, but a really spectacular increase in political activity. So repoliticization without reinstitutionalization. So this is the more quantitative side of the story. Obviously, we can then classify these different eras we see on this graph in a more conceptual sense and make them correspond with different forms of political engagement. So one indicator is how highly politicized is the society, so how much people are participating in elections, how many people are participating in protests, and then the other question is how strongly institutionalized is society. And that gives you the kind of quadrant we're looking at here. So a society that's both highly institutionalized and highly politicized is what is here called mass politics. I think we still need to make a distinction between different types of mass politics here. You have a wilder variant of mass politics in the 1930s and 1940s, and then let's say a more embedded or quieter variant in the 1950s and 1960s. What's very clear is that political engagement and institutional membership are very hard to uncouple there. Then in the 1990s and the 2000s, you get a situation in which there is decline both on the institutional and on the political axis. That is the era of so-called post-politics. And then if you look at the era of the 2010s, we see this paradoxical new development, which doesn't really have a precedent, and this is also why there needs to be a new name for a new thing, namely the era of hyperpolitics. So high politicization, but very low institutionalization. The book also has one chapter on a variant which is called anti-politics, which I think describes the first phase of new political activity in the early 2010s. It's mainly a way of talking about the so-called phenomenon that's often summarized under the term of populism, which I think is not the most careful term to describe all of this. There is still a difference between, let's say, anti-politics and hyperpolitics, also in the kind of institutional horizon that these early protest movements had in the 2010s and the ones that then came in the later 2010s. But that is, I think, a distinction that is better looked at if you just look at the book itself. So the book is about this new political form called hyperpolitics, and it asks itself the question, what is it? And that's the descriptive part. Then it asks itself an analytical question, where did it come from? So what are the causal sources of this change in political culture after 2008? And then it asks a question, what are its promises and what are its limits? So what is interesting or what is potentially emancipatory about the new hyperpolitical moment? And then the second question is, what are some of the constraints or what are some of the things that are very, very difficult to do in this new hyperpolitical era? So as I said, I'm obviously not the first person to talk about these themes, and even the notion of hyperpolitics itself was first introduced by the German political philosopher Peter Sloterdijk in the middle of the 1990s. It meant something slightly different with him than the kind of diagnosis that I'm putting forward. At the same time, there is overlap insofar as to him there was already a very important discussion in the 1990s and the 2000s of what was called the so-called individualization literature. Namely, what does it mean to have a society in which all these institutional organizations are in a very profound crisis? But then he asked himself this question, what would politics look like in a society in which parties and collective organizations no longer have these representative mandates? There is more recent work that I think overlaps with this diagnosis more strongly, and most famously there's the book by Jürgen Habermas, so eine neue Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit, that really speaks to the same diagnosis. So of course it's an update of the doctoral thesis he published in the early 1960s about the structural transformation of the public sphere. And now in the last 5 years he's written a new version, much shorter, of course, of that original book, in which he speaks about, let's say, a new structural transformation of the public sphere. To him, this is a transformation that's very closely connected to the rise also of social media. So in that sense, there is an important discussion to be had about what is it about political activity in the 2010s that's easily facilitated by social media. At the same time, I think there's a tendency in Habermas's work to treat, let's say, digital or social media as a monocausal explanation of the rise of this new political culture. As if you can simply say that all the new political activity can be related to the declining costs of political expression, which social media has brought with it. While my question is rather, no, in what kind of political environment were these social media platforms launched that made it so easy for people to then latch onto them and also apply them for types of political mobilization? So that is the more descriptive and analytical part. I just want to finish with one testimony by an American journalist on the eve of the election of 2020, in which she repeats some of the hypotheses we see with Janan Ganesh. So she says, I've always been interested in politics. For much of my life, this was a niche interest. But then she continues, the election of Donald Trump has made politics all-consuming. Everything has become political, from what sports you watch, what products you buy, and even how you protect your own health. The people who once shared cat videos on the internet now share stridently political memes, and third-tier staffers have become celebrities. So once again, it's an indication of the new political culture I'm talking about. The question then becomes, what are the promises and the limits, or what is normatively interesting about this new political form, and what are its potential constraints? For that, I want to return to a classic of 20th century political analysis and political theory, namely Max Weber's Politics as a Vocation, or in the more sophisticated German Politik als Beruf. Oh, it's actually not the right title, but yeah, whatever, it's the counterpart to the same lecture. We see a picture here on the left of Weber probably delivering a political speech in the early Weimar era, in which he shortly thought that he could also launch a political career of his own. But I think that this statement by Weber gives us a very, very good indication of the type of politics which mass politics was in the 20th century and how it differs from the hyperpolitical era we find ourselves in now. And so famously, Weber described politics as, quote, a slow, strong drilling through hard boards, requiring both passion and a sense of judgment. The person fit to take part in politics had to be a leader, and actually he uses the word Führer in this very quote, which was omnipresent but takes on a very specific association, of course, later in the 1930s. Indeed, the politician must, in a very simple sense of the word, be a hero, and even those who are neither of these things must put on the armor of that steadfastness of heart which can withstand the defeat of all hopes. Now, what is important to notice contextually about Weber's lecture is that, of course, it's anything but a manifesto for radicalism. So it's delivered in the winter of 1919, which is the time of the so-called German Revolution. And his remarks are actually a veiled critique of the revolutionary impatience of the German Communist Party, who sought to import the Russian Revolution into Germany. This is also very clear in the audience that was listening to Weber's lectures, which were students from a nationalist fraternity, who probably wanted a career in the new Weimar state bureaucracy, and which were probably also being groomed at the time to serve in so-called paramilitary formations, the Freikorps, that then would come to quash the German Revolution. What's very important to see, however, is that despite this hostility towards the far left that you see in this lecture by Weber, you still see they're also children of the same age. So however top-down his plea for politics as a vocation, it does affirm a form of politics that's much more institutionalized and that is much more organizational than the hyperpolitics we see today. Both Weber and his ideological adversities shared a vision of political engagement that was markedly more patient and sustained than the one we find in the 21st century. So to them, of course, the personal may have been the political, yet it would be very difficult to purely reduce the political to the personal. So the mass politics of Weber's time was certainly not less heated than our own hyperpolitical moment. And when Weber was delivering this lecture, there were shoulders and students shooting outside, yet it was way more solidly institutionalized. And that obviously also has an effect on the capacity for certain movements to change the power balance within society. So if we look at some of these recent protest movements, particularly in the US, you get a sense of the difficulty these new hyperpolitical instances have in actually changing social structures. So this is from 2020, from the end of the summer. There's already reports at the New York Times that Black Lives Matter may be the largest movement in US history. And actually recent research has borne this out, with some of the record estimates going towards 25 million participants. Even compared to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, these are incredibly high numbers which haven't been seen before. So just purely in terms of data, it's absolutely spectacular. But when you then look at the institutional, or let's say the policy legacy of these movements, there's a profound ambiguity. So you have the largest protest movement in US history, and you see that 5 years after date, and many of the social problems and questions that it actually mobilized around have actually become worse. And so as the New York Times indicated last year, since George Floyd's murder, police killings have been kept rising, not falling, and the number of people killed by police has risen every year since the murder of Mr. Floyd by a Minneapolis officer in 2020. I think this indicates some of the normative ambiguity that you see in the story about hyperpolitics. So of course we do not need to buy into the nostalgia for apathy you find in Janan Ganesh, where he says, I would like to return to a world in which no one shows up to vote and no one shows up to protest, in which Western politics was much quieter. At the same time, an unreserved enthusiasm for some of these recent protest movements just runs into the difficulty that their institutional achievements have become quite weak. This is obviously also a problem in Europe, where you can look at the case of the Gilets jaunes, but all across these different movements, there is a question of how are you able to mobilize such a large number of people, but then not actually translate into policy change. There is a similar question now with a rise in protest in the US after the killing of an American citizen by the so-called immigration authorities at ICE, who've been strongly empowered, of course, by the second Trump administration. There is a debate to be had whether it's been easier for, let's say, the far right to institutionalize some of this hyperpolitical activity than it has been for the left. But even here, there remains the question, both on the right and the left, how is it that so much political activity today doesn't seem to translate into institutional change? I'm going to leave it at that because I think I'm already almost at 40 minutes. But yes, feel free to ask any questions, both about the descriptive, the analytical, and then also about the normative part. And thank you again for listening. If there are any questions.
Thank you. This was really fascinating. And it reasons a lot with what, of course, we see, we observe. While you were talking, I'm a political scientist, and I had a couple of questions that were recurring in my mind, and one has to do, obviously, with political cleavages. Yeah. So how this story relates to that, because when you showed that graph, right, of also the work of Peter Mayer, this has a lot to do with the fact that basically mass parties, so the institutionalization of politics, is linked to this traditional cleavage that we saw with post-materialism falling. Yeah. So that's a story that I completely buy. And I really enjoyed that you tried to put those two things together, the deinstitutionalization and then the rise of politics again. And that made me think, especially with regard to the repoliticization, especially that part to the work of Liliana Mason. And that's mostly based in US, right? And basically what she shows about, you also called, right, polarization. She said, well, we have a moment of polarization and hence of high politicizations, because what happened is that the Democrat Party said like this, and the Republican Party did this. And this, of course, calls for values, right, to be, it's undeniable that, especially since we have Trump, but also when you think about repoliticization in Europe, the things that you showed, those have a lot to do with far-right parties.
Yes, yeah.
Right? So I was wondering how these two elements, cleavage politics and the surge of far-right parties, relate to this story that you are telling us.
Shall I answer this question already? Yes, okay. Yes, thank you. So the book doesn't very explicitly treat the cleavage question, but it is obviously completely continuous with that discussion. I think there is a causal question there, which is, why did mass politics disappear? Or what is the best explanation for that deinstitutionalization, so the downward sloping part of the graph we're looking at? And one explanation you've hinted at is to say these parties lost their constituencies or their traditional bases which they could represent, which has to do with the declining salience of some of these cleavages. And then a typical Belgian, I'm taking the Belgian case here, is, in a profoundly secularized or non-religious society, it becomes very difficult for, let's say, a Catholic Democratic Party to stake a representative claim, and thereby it loses its institutional grip. I think that is part of the story, but there is, I think, an uneasiness I have with the cleavage discussion is that it tends to naturalize the downward sloping curve to such an extent where they say it's just a product of long-term sociological trends that have been going on for so long, whether it's secularization, individualization, so parties just find it much harder to retain members because the way they relate to those, or the reason why they represent those members has disappeared. If there are no more Catholics in your society, how can you survive as a Catholic party? But if you look at some of the data, and I'm going to go back to this curve here, there's a reason why, I'm just going to go here. If you see, for example, this, the 1970s are a very difficult period for this theory, because on the one hand, you say you have a long-term structural trend towards the declining salience of these cleavages, and that would make it very hard for people to still be able to institutionalize themselves. But then the gradual decline of mass politics finds it very hard to talk about the fact, why is the 70s then a certain blip? Or why is there then again a massive increase in political activity and the foundation of new types of political parties? Which means you can't just have a story about, let's say, secularization or individualization, but particularly of why there's such an aggressive drop-off point in 1989 in the early 90s. And I think there the Italian case is really striking, is that the 1980s are still a protest of, let's say, if you look at the PSI in Italy or something, membership seems to be still very, very healthy. And then suddenly 1989 and 1990, it completely drops off and it basically liquidates. And then the question can't just be, oh, the cleavage has become less salient. No, certain political decisions have been made that make it very difficult for people to relate to politics in the same way. And there, I'd say that's not just a cleavage story, it's a political economy story almost, about what are the political preconditions for the transition from the order of the 1980s into the 1990s. So the book has a chapter on this. It's a tricky question of what the drivers are. Cleavages are important, but I don't think only talking about cleavages is going to get you the full story of what actually happens. When it comes to polarization, and if I understand it correctly, the asymmetry there is between, let's say, the right-wing variant of this new hyperpolitical area and the left, I think it's very clear that in terms of, let's say, not just election success, but also participation in government, the far right has, or let's say the right part of the spectrum has profited more of that new environment than parts of the left have. What are the reasons for this? I think several hypotheses can be given. Maybe the benchmark in terms of success is not as high on the right as it is on the left. So if you make a contrast, let's say, between Salvini in Italy and, let's say, Tsipras in Greece, you can both win an election and get into government and then try to carry out a program. In the left-wing case, you're punished for it more severely if you're unable to carry it out. And there might also be a question of, do you have access to certain types of private funds which parties on the left don't have access to? And so you can have a lot of hyperpolitical activity on the left and on the right. And I do want to indicate that it's not just a story of the right exclusively or the left exclusively. It happens across the spectrum. But maybe because you have access to private funds, it thereafter becomes much easier for the right to institutionalize some of this protest activity into structures that then can be financed with private money. I think what you're seeing with the second Trump term, where they're clearly trying to go for a more institutionalized version of the politics they first pioneered in 2016, there are attempts at this. To say that there's such a thing as a mass movement behind Trumpism, that I find a bit more complicated. Because it's not, I mean, look at something like January 6th, there are no membership lists, there's no official sense of when you're in or out of the movement. It's very elite driven, it's very much dependent on certain elite actors. There, it does seem that it's not clear that mass politics has been reinvented in that typical sense on the right, while it hasn't been able to do so on the left. So these are some of the things I'd say both on the cleavage and the polarization story.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot, Anton. It's really interesting. And I had a question about the, in terms of people becoming more active or less active in political organizations. And the argument, I think, made by Peter Mayer and others seems to be that part of the reason behind this is that mainstream parties have become increasingly indistinguishable from one another and are kind of this kind of massive mainstream neoliberal third wayism. So I was wondering what you think of that argument, and also if that means that one possible solution to this might be that we need parties that are more partisan, that have stronger profiles and have stronger identities, and whether that could partly solve this problem or not.
Yes. So with Mayer, there's obviously an etiology or a causal story about where he thinks the crisis of party democracy comes from, which is partly, as I said, a cleavage story about the declining salience of some of these social differences and thereby the difficulty they have in representing constituencies. But to him, for Mayer, there's also a very large political economy story, which you hint at, which is about the fusing of parties with the state, so the so-called cartelization story that everyone knows, and what you could broadly call unelected bodies or technocracy. And so if parties lose the capacity to even offer political choice to their voters, to say, well, if you vote for us, you'll get this program. If you vote for us, you'll get a different program. If, as you say, there's a kind of homogenization of policy where parties don't even get to make those choices anymore because they're made elsewhere, then obviously it's logical why there would be political apathy, because people begin to realize, well, no matter who we vote for, there is actually no choice matrix here. Parties will simply carry out whatever is decided elsewhere. That story with Mayer is not enormously sophisticated. It's very suggestive, so I don't think he had the time to fully work it out, but there's so much other work that is complementary with this thesis that shows the political economy side of this story, let's say about the rise of technocracy or the kind of outsourcing of decision-making, which obviously overlaps with the literature on neoliberalism, that you mentioned. So that is easy to tell. The question whether the response is just an increasing partisanship, to me, is unclear. Because if you look at the US case, and this goes back to the previous question, it's very obvious that partisanship and polarization are at record highs there. Does that mean that, let's say, popular control over state decision-making has increased? I'm really unsure about this. So an increase in partisanship and an increase in political control or popular control don't seem to correlate very strongly there. You can have a type of polarization that is completely orthogonal to, let's say, large structural questions. So you can have two parties that are mortal enemies of each other, but in the end the central bank will still make the most important decision on how the economy is run. And there I don't think just an increase in partisanship is going to solve the issue. There is indeed an argument to be made to say, well, parties should look less alike, there should be more ideological competition, they should be more openly partisan. But that, I think, leaves open the question, what is the object of that partisanship? What are the disagreements about? And can these disagreements then also be translated into policy? And I think the US case shows that you can have a highly polarized, divided political system with even a lot of political violence nowadays, where political violence in the US has really risen spectacularly in the last 5 years. But it doesn't seem to me to mean that the power gradient has tilted towards more, let's say, bottom-up influence. Loads of dimensions to explore it, but once again, I don't think there's a natural correlation between partisanship and popular control there.
Yes. Thank you, Anton. This is really fascinating. I have two questions. First, is Hyperpolitics also an explanation for the rise of Euroscepticism? Because we know that Euroscepticism gathers groups, extremes from the both sides, far and left. Even though they have different arguments to contest European Union, what they have in common is the contestation of the European project, first of all. And second, you said very clearly that well, this Hyperpolitics has benefited the far right, that's true. We are assisting now to the normalization and the mainstreaming of far right because they have entered more than 1/3 of the governments in the European Union. Yeah. But I mean, would you agree that the reason why is only because they use very efficiently emotions? What about arguments? Do they have arguments that convince people? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so on the Euroscepticism question, I'm not entirely sure whether this concept is really able to make sense of all political phenomena that we can detect, let's say, in the last 10 to 15 years, I think there is something to the idea that a profoundly deinstitutionalized political system, in which membership is very low and which the tie to political parties is very weak, also makes for a political debate in which ideological positions are very syncretic and difficult to predict. So what parties in the 20th century, sometimes in a very authoritarian way, did for their members was also offer a possibility for cognitive mapping. You had a certain worldview which is incalculated by the party, and that means that if you had one specific viewpoint on a specific issue, that obviously translated into another set of beliefs that came with this. With the unmooring of political parties, that means people can now take a certain political position, but that doesn't mean you can read off what their other views are based off that one political position either. So there's a lot on this on the polarization literature, is that someone can hold one opinion on the COVID vaccine and then another opinion on a different subject. And precisely because there are no sort of institutional reference for any of these ideological points, it becomes very unpredictable. And this, I think, is a better way of saying how is it that, let's say, Euroscepticism appears both on the left and the right and can unite people in all kinds of unpredictable coalitions. This is not completely new, but I think it is also partly a story of the deinstitutionalization we're talking about here. The second point about emotions, yes, but I don't see how the center left or even at the center there is no appeal to emotions necessarily. I think that there's more of a question of why is it that since the 90s and the 2000s, there's been a tendential increase for far-right parties on the electoral level. In the 2010s, there has been a qualitative leap, namely, they're no longer simply participants in electoral systems or oppositional forces, but they've actually all become contenders for government. So, as you say, 1/3 of these governments are now populated by far-right parties or are in some kind of coalition agreement. And the question then becomes, why have they been able to translate some of the political energy of the 2010s, so the increasing voter turnout, for example, in the way that they've actually become governmental players as well? And I don't think that's a purely rhetorical question. It's not just a question of how they've appealed to their voters. It's also a question of how they've suppressed or gotten rid of parts of their program, and clearly they've been able to build certain voter blocks that are much more difficult to build on other sides of the political spectrum. Maybe partly through appeals to emotion, but I don't think that's the whole of the story.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to ask you about the empty quadrant. So when you presented the one with mass politics and hyperpolitics.
Here, yes.
So there is the empty one for institutionalization and politicization.
So low politicization, high institutionalization.
Yes. And there I wanted to ask if you think that is a form of political culture that's impossible or something that's not analytically interesting, in a sense that I can think about. Because also when we speak about the decline in membership in unions and political parties,
yes.
I mean, it is an overall trend, but there's a lot of variance there.
Of course. Yeah,
so we can think about contexts like Nordics, Iceland, where being in a union is still mandatory by law.
Yeah.
But those unions are entirely depoliticized, where they're just fact of life. Or we can think about Austria, when there's still a lot of organizations around the workplace.
Or even Belgium.
Or, I wanted to get that, Belgium, that is outlier in terms of associationalism until now. Yeah. So that would be my first question, and relatedly to that, in terms of the current hyperpolitics juncture, I wonder, what is your take on do you think it is transitory period, in the sense that you mentioned that there's already efforts toward institutionalization. And there it's happening with ICE, with Trump, but with Scandinavia, we can also bottom up, soldiers of Odin, there's a lot of weird things happening. And on that, I wanted to ask to what extent you think this is a current prognosis that actors on both left and right try to move outward of. And that relates to my first question. In different contexts, might it be easier to move out of this if the level of institutionalization remained higher? And here we get to Belgium, where, like in the current situation, like the fact that the union membership remained higher is making the introduction of the reforms, neoliberal reforms, more difficult. Whereas, for example, where I'm from in Poland, where gray men in suits from IMF disbanded all the unions in the 90s, any leftist organization is happening from scratch, necessarily.
Yeah.
So there's this lag between hyperpolitics and some form of mass politics would be perhaps larger in Belgium.
No, enormously important questions. Thank you so much. So on the empty quadrant, there is a part of me who, if I were to rewrite or write the book anew today, would place that more embedded, quieter form of mass politics in that empty quadrant. Because you can imagine a type of high institutionalization, so very large or high party membership or high union membership, but with no political consciousness whatsoever. I think in the US, that is often a story told about the 50s and 60s, namely quite an institutionalized society, but not one with a lot of political engagement. I think that story is ambiguous. I mean, if you look at strike activity in the US, there's a strike wave in the late 50s. I mean, even in Belgium, the largest strike wave in the 20th century was actually in 1960 to 1961. So the story we tell about the Trente Glorieuses is often one of low politicization, high institutionalization, but in practice, actually, that's much more ambiguous. In a Tocquevillian sense, that's a Tocquevillian dream, right? Namely, everyone's in their little platoons and in their civil society organizations, but they're not doing any crazy political radicalism. But I'd say the embedded form of mass politics can be in there. The example of passive membership, I think, is also an instance of this in a more contemporary setting. Insofar as you say, there are a lot of European cases where, for example, unionization remains relatively high, but the political activation of that base proves very difficult. And one spectacular example of this in Belgium is that the FGTB or ABVV, so the traditionally socialist union, has internal statistics that about 40%, I think, I have to look up the numbers, but it's really spectacularly high. About 40% of the membership are far-right voters. And so there's a massive disconnect between the union card you have and your political preference, which means that the relationship to the union you have is purely a service-related relationship and is not a political one. And that is also the reason why within these unions there are now these long-standing attempts to politicize their own membership, to translate their union membership into a specific political preference and to say, if you're a card-carrying member of our union, you should not be voting for the far right. So yes, there is a form of institutionalization that doesn't translate into low politicization. Your second question relates to this because I think it is ambiguous. On the one hand, this high level of institutionalization might make politicization difficult, and it's precisely the strategic dilemma which these unions have vis-à-vis their members who vote for the far right, because they say, if we're going to interpolate them and ask them not to vote for the far right, that might push them out of the union. Because they might say, you have nothing to say about our political preferences, you're simply here to defend us in the workplace, do not become a political actor to us. And this means that, let's say, the move from the top left quadrant to the quadrant there or even there to the bottom right might be rendered more difficult because of the high institutionalization, precisely because you have such a transactional or even clientelistic relationship to your union that you will not tolerate political interference from them. At the same time, the Polish counterfactual, the difference between Poland and Belgium is very clear. Why is it that it took so long to introduce some of the market reforms which other European countries already were submitted to in the 1990s and the 2000s in Belgium? It clearly has to do something with a union buffer. Right? The union buffer and I think also the non-majoritarian political system, so the fact that you constantly have to form coalitions also across the language divide, makes it very difficult to implement a pro-market neoliberal program. It's now happening with 20 years delay, as Bart de Wever likes to say. Belgium is finally becoming a normal country, but it's very obvious who was always, let's say, on the brakes when it comes to this program. And this, I think, is the ambiguity we're talking about. The move from the Tocquevillian empty quadrant to the right-wing part of the quadrant can be rendered difficult by institutionalization. At the same time, having an institutional base clearly also makes it easier to block all kinds of things, insofar as you at least have a list of members you can call and say, there is a protest on Monday against the recent government program. Let us explain to you what is included in this program and why you should be against it. It can go both ways. Asking your members to vote against the far right and mobilizing them against a certain government program, both of those things are possible.
Thank you, Anton. I very much enjoyed the lecture. I look forward to reading the book. I would like to invite you to expand a bit on your normative views and the normative aspects of your diagnosis, and to push you a bit, or as an invitation, a very open question. Hyperpolitics, is that a pathology or a condition? And is it a pathology or the sum of all other existing pathologies, like individualization? Omran mentioned neoliberalism. So how to make sense of that? If it's just a condition, like one of the previous transformations of representative democracy, I'm thinking of Bernard Manin, Nadia Urbinati. How can you make sense of that? There was, with past late Manin, a big discussion between Nadia Urbinati and Bernard Manin on whether or not audience/spectacle hyper-democracy was a pathology or not. And Nadia was very vehement on it being bad in Trumpian terms. But Manin felt like this is something we just have to kind of suck it up and deal with it. This is a change. So where do you stand?
Okay, a very confrontational question for me. I will say that some of the language I've been using, so of a diagnosis or a prognosis, makes for a certain medicinal or clinical jargon, which makes it seem as if I'm describing pathologies. At the same time, if you look at each of these political forms, each of them is a pathology in their own way. Post-politics obviously is pathological. You only need to read the novels by Michel Houellebecq from the 90s and 2000s to get a sense of how, let's say, diseased that form can seem. Hyperpolitics obviously has something frenetic and very nervous about it that makes it seem pathological. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget that there's so much literature about the mass political age as one of secular religions and of the idea that people have now traded their investment in religion into politics that is obviously also pathological. What that means is obviously if each of these forms is pathological, then none of them is. So I don't think it's helpful to invoke a certain ideal of normality and say, once we were democratically healthy, everything was institutionalized and people had a sense of what political one looked like, and now everything is unbalanced. I very much think it's a condition. It's a structural condition that applies both on the left and the right. And in that sense, there is not... I want to be very clinical about this and say, we're looking at a new type of political engagement that has very deep roots. You can like it or you can hate it, but you do have to realize that it's not an individual moral problem that deserves condemnation. And in that sense, I'd be more on the side of Manin than Urbinati, in the sense that Urbinati has a very strong tendency to pathologize these new political forms, obviously also because of her own political sympathies, but I don't think that helps you understand them more firmly. At the same time, even if you do not want to pathologize, that's what I indicated at the end, I do think you need to ask yourself the question, what is the horizon of this new hyperpolitical condition? Even if it's not a pathology, it comes with certain limits and constraints. And that means it was easier to achieve certain things in, let's say, the mass political era than it is in the hyperpolitical era. And that leads you to a strategic conclusion, whether you're on the right or on the left. What are the preconditions for social change? And what you see nowadays, I think, is quite a cruel paradox, where hyperpolitics encourages a lot of mobilization and also contestation, but it's proven very difficult to translate it into policy change. And if you would like to see policy or social change, the question then becomes, is reinstitutionalization possible? And I'd be, let's say, quite prescriptive here, is that if hyperpolitics is a form of repoliticization without reinstitutionalization, and if this means that it becomes very difficult to translate political preferences into actual policy change, you do have to ask yourself the question, what institutional forms are feasible in the new century that will make it possible to change things without being nostalgic and thinking that you can, as they say, clone a dinosaur. You cannot go back to the 20th century and look for the DNA of these mass parties and then implement them into the new environment and hope that they will survive. At the same time, this permanent impermanence you see with hyperpolitics makes very bold claims about social change, but at the end is unable to actually carry it through. And that doesn't mean that hyperpolitics is pathology. It's more a question of saying, here is the new structural condition. It comes with certain limits. Can we transcend those limits? But that is a different question, because that's a question of what are the institutional forms that are adequate to the era, that are neither purely nostalgic or that fully embrace the fluidity and the indeterminacy of this new political culture that I think are, bound to disappoint many people. Because you have 25 million people in the streets, the largest number in American history, and 5 years later there's no institutional structure, and on the policy level things have gotten worse. I mean, it's a difficult conclusion to reach.
Can I go direct? Well, thank you, and also thank you, the audience, for the nice discussion. I was indeed moving. I wanted to move from this point to, okay, if it's a condition, and as you say, I think it's quite nicely described how there is a difficulty then to bring change at policy level. But there is maybe a variability in the type of, like you showed the Black Lives Matter, but for instance, if you look at the climate movement, for a short amount of time, but there has been an institutionalization of the type of impulse that came out of something that was a protest actually, and was embedded into some political or institutional framework that led to some change, ephemeral possibly. And maybe this question was more relevant 2 years ago because now they are dismantling it. But there has been a take-up, if you think of European Union or even some countries. So I'm thinking, is there something in the topic? Is there something that you can draw from the different experiences? Some went a bit further than others into bringing some actual change and some political impact, other not. How do you explain it, if it's relevant?
Yes, so I don't want to say, or I don't want to be misunderstood in the sense that I think hyperpolitics doesn't imply any institutional consequences or even an institutional dimension. That's never the case, because there's no such thing as pure spontaneity. And there is obviously the fact that large protest movements have had really major socio-cultural effects, and particularly also discursive effects. So even if you look at these numbers, so this is the institutional story, the original problem which was, let's say, contested, or which was under discussion at the time. It's gotten worse. But if you look at some of the other indicators, whether it's tolerance for interracial marriage or the actual views of the problem of police violence in the US and public consciousness around this, that has really increased dramatically in the last 5 years. But that leads to quite a cruel paradox. You can have a society that has a general consensus on the existence of a problem. Police violence in the US is problematic. And it has a general agreement that something needs to be done about this, but then if you look at the actual institutional level, there's nothing to be seen around this preference. And I mean, and there's a kind of counterpart with the fact that there's been a very large majority for public health care in the US for at least 20 years now. It's only increased in the last 10 years. But when you look at the institutional chances of pushing this through, they've only become slimmer in the last 5 years. And this means that it's not like there are no consequences, it's just the consequences happen on the level of consciousness raising or of the socio-cultural atmosphere of that society, but it doesn't necessarily translate into an institutional reality. And in the US, you have the situation of a society that's become more anti-racist, but structurally more racially unequal. That is completely possible. And so people, in a purely mental sense, have a feeling that something needs to be done, but nothing is actually being done. I think on the climate issue, it's not exactly the same, but the mobilization around climate has obviously had an institutional legacy and a policy legacy. It was really a top priority, particularly in EU level policy making for quite a while. But if you look at, let's say, what the German government's latest plans are to relaunch themselves on levels of industrial strategy, when it comes to Chinese competition on electric vehicles, etc., it's very ambiguous what this means for the more ambitious versions of climate policy there are now. In the end, I think there's only one serious climate actor on a world scale now, and it remains China. And I do also think that has something to do with a particular kind of institutional organ they have, namely a party. And that party facilitates certain types of economic and also political action. It's obviously not the product of a protest movement. It's not as if there's a mass climate movement in China. But there is a reason why I think China is the only serious climate actor, is because they have the institutional structures to carry it out. While in Europe, I mean, let alone the US, I mean, the US is now on the level of climate just purely reactionary. But in Europe, I think it's the difficulty to institutionalize this eco-consciousness on the institutional level that has also led to some of the setbacks of the last year, where the German government, I think, has almost committed itself to a form of carbon protectionism and not actually thinking seriously about what it would mean to do a green transition also on the level of the car industry, which is ambiguous, right? Because there was so much energy around this question previously.
Yeah, thanks, Anton, so far also for the interesting discussion. I think I had a question about the sort of the necessary link or translation of this politicization into institutionalization, as in, is institutionalization the only way to translate social mobilizations? As in, I feel like you've used institutionalizations in two ways in your presentation, and on the one hand, institutionalization of people in mass parties, party membership, union membership, and so on. On the other hand, institutionalization as in policy change. This is the only way to translate movements into actual policy change by translating that into a party. And does that mean is membership of parties, for instance, or that's something that has been talked about on the empty quadrant, but is membership of parties, of unions, necessarily more participatory?
Yeah.
If membership of parties would be higher, do people actually have the feeling that they can contribute?
Yes.
So would that be a solution to what we see is happening here?
No, that's a very important question, and it goes back to the empty quadrant discussion, where the type of passive membership, so high institutionalization with low politicization, and it's very true that a level of high institutionalization does not necessarily imply that you have a bigger capacity for policy change. Because let's look at Belgian unions in the last 5 years. I think their membership number has actually increased still. So 60% of the working population in Belgium is in a union. It's quite an exception and an outlier compared to neighboring countries where the decline has continued, while in Belgium it's actually grown. But on the level of policy making, it's very clear that the unions have less and less influence on how governments make decisions. So the kind of tripartite or corporatist tradition that Belgium still had, where even in the 1980s and 1990s with some of these previous austerity governments, all of the decisions were still made in consultation with the unions. So it's a particular form of social bargaining that, let's say, led Belgium into the 1990s and 2000s, where some of these budget exercises were always done in a tripartite discussion between government, employers, and then particularly the Christian Democratic Union, where a high level of institutionalization translates into influence for policy, while now that is not the case. And so even having high institutionalization does not guarantee you a seat at the table. To me, you can achieve policy change without institutionalization, but what does that come down to? It comes down to elite pressure. And elite pressure is a very capricious and unpredictable game, because what that commits you to is finding fractions of the elite that then can form a coalition, that then can get into power and get into government. I think it's slightly what some people or some Trumpite intellectuals have done. They found certain parts within the Republican Party, without building a mass movement, that they can use to get into office and then carry out their program. An elite pressure campaign, I think, is not necessarily ineffective, but as I said, it's very unpredictable. And there's the obvious asymmetry I talked about, is that is much easier on the right than on the left, because it's not as if left-wing or progressive parties find it very easy to find factions within the elite that are willing to ally with them. So I think for the Greens, you can make the argument that there are certain fractions of the business community that are really interested in a green transition, particularly from a financial point of view. Maybe you can appeal to them. But for the rest, it's unclear to me how or what fractions of the elite are going to be receptive to your message. And this does lead you back to the institutionalization question. So if there's no fraction of the elite that's receptive to you, you have to have institutional power to back up your claim. And that's, I think, it remains the only way to translate it into policy change. But there is no guarantee, because high institutionalization, as we said, could still mean that you're sidelined on the level of actual governmental decision-making, and I think this is the situation in which Belgian unions find themselves in now.
Thank you. A more trivial question. What made you choose the picture you choose for the cover of your English version of the book? What does it say?
This one.
Yeah.
This one. Oh, that is a very, I mean, it's not a very long story. You can just read the opening chapter of the book. It's a picture by a German photographer called Wolfgang Tillmann, so probably one of the most famous contemporary artists. They're photographs that were taken of a party that was held in Berlin in 1989. So it's a photograph of a woman at a nightclub, I think in East Berlin, shortly after the wall fell. But Tillmann's in the opening chapter is kind of used as a symptom for that change in political culture from the mass political era to the post-politics of the 1990s and the 2000s, because the way he describes the experience of these parties and then also his entire worldview throughout his career is very reflective of some of the changes I'm talking about. So I start with his photographs and say, well, if you look at Tillmann's changing artistic output from the early 1990s to 2010s, you can see an interesting reflection of the changes in political culture I'm talking about, because now recently, for example, he's had exhibitions where he's photographed not parties, but actual Black Lives Matter protests, for example. And so in that way, it's a way to kickstart the entire discussion. It's definitely not a part of the more hard-nosed political sociology, which the rest of the book is interested in.
Thanks, Anton. Can you... yes, I was interested in that graph. So you start in 1900, and I wonder, have you thought about what happens with your categories if you apply them to the 19th century?
Yes.
I mean, are they applicable at all? I'm just thinking about France before the 1848 revolution. Yes. I mean, you have like mass movements, workers' movements, and of course that doesn't translate into policies because you don't have a workers' party.
Yeah.
And then what happens at the end of the road is that you have a revolution. So so I guess one question is like, what about the 19th century? And it's a very broad question, but I just want to hear your thoughts about this. And then the second question is like, is revolution one of like the, the kind of like, one of the things that could happen, one of the consequences of hyperpolitics?
On the first question, yes. So the book is mainly a 20th and a 21st century story. It makes this chronology where it says mass politics, so this part of the quadrant there, is born somewhere between 1848 and 1914, which is obviously a really ridiculous way to periodize. But I think there's some truth to that because, as you say, the Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, which is actually not called the Communist Manifesto, but the Manifesto for the Communist Party, is a very open plea to create or to institutionalize political activity. Because during 1848, you've had several decades and years of intense protest activity, also strike activity, and the argument Marx and Engels make is this is all very important, but it's not going anywhere without the institutional organ of the party. And then from 1848 onwards, starting on the left, but also on the right, this is something that should not be forgotten, but the right is interested in mass politics very early on, as I said, for example, with the Conservative Party in Britain, to control democratization. You have a steady institutionalization of political engagement. But if you were to extend this graph, my hypothesis would be that you have a kind of symmetry of it. Namely, here we have an X-shaped development, while in the 19th century, institutionalization is still relatively high when you look, for example, at the religious dimension of it. But it's not as if parties exist. It's not as if unions exist. Even on an elite level, parties get introduced very late. I mean, the Bernard Manin story is very famous about this, that parties as an institution take a long time to be accepted by all kinds of different factions or sides of the political spectrum. But the period of the 1830s and 1840s, before 1848, does show a very interesting resemblance with some of the material we see on this graph, namely a level of quite high politicization, but necessarily high institutionalization. Because it's illegal to form unions in many European countries. Parties are not necessarily the way that either radicals or conservatives see political action. But at the same time, you have strike activity, you have protest activity without that institutional structure. And that, I think, is probably the most promising precedent for the situation we're talking about today. So instead of going back to the 1930s and 1940s, that might be a more adequate analogy for our situation. Keeping in mind, of course, that this is a pre-democratic era in many cases. General suffrage is not an established fact. It's still to be achieved in many European countries. It still takes 100 years, particularly in Britain, only after 1918. So I think that's a big difference with today, is that is before democratization actually sets in. The second question is about, what was it about? Sorry, yes. I mean, at the same time, I'm not interested in making predictions. I do think that if you look at previous instances of revolutionary breaks, they obviously combine a very high level of politicization with an adequate level of institutionalization. So whether it's, for example, the Russian case or any other revolution across the 20th century, you have an intense burst of political activity, but you also have an institutional structure that can absorb this activity and translate it into a rupture with the regime. And what I do think is striking about hyperpolitical activity is that since the institutional structure is lacking, it becomes much more difficult to instantiate a revolutionary rupture. And there's some really interesting work about this in Eastern Europe, where throughout the 2000s and 2010s, you have these very impressive protest movements that bring down certain presidents and, let's say, certain political establishments. But when you look at what they accomplish, not on the level of politics, but on the level of the economy or social change, actually nothing changes. And so, for example, someone has talked about Ukrainian politics in the 2010s, so before the Russian invasion, as political revolutions without social revolutions. Because, for example, the distribution of wealth or the distribution of power in society doesn't necessarily change after those revolutions. What changes is the political personnel. That can be changed. While if you look at a revolution in a more classical 20th century sense, it's both a profound political but also a social rupture. It completely changes the class sociology of a society. But you can clearly have certain types of regime change that do not imply a social revolution. And that, I think, is one way of talking about the revolutionary potential of hyperpolitics. Is maybe politically something can change, but that doesn't mean that other domains of society are necessarily affected. Yes, it's 2, so it's perfect. Thank you. Thank you.